Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. Fremder, étranger, stranger. Glücklich zu sehen, je suis enchanté. Happy to see you, Lucas and Zack podcast to stay. What's up, guys?
I love the contrast between you singing and me singing. It tells a lot about our personalities. So I'm
What
just
is
like,
the
fuck it. You saw something to do. Da, 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 da.
what is the contrast between you and me singing?
You're like putting so much effort in trying, and I more or less just shout into the camera and make it up as I go along.
Well, I'm a trained singer. I did this my entire childhood up until I was like 17 years old. So I have some ability left in my decrepit body to sing. So I thought for the month of musical adaptations month, I would be singing some songs and making the good times happen. Welcome in to new month, June. We're doing movies that are based on Broadway musicals. The adaptation, the musical has to come first. And very important part of this, it's not movies that were movies that and then went to Broadway and then came back. Has to be an adaptation on Broadway first. Um, yeah. So,
Are you explaining why we're doing this?
oh, I
Yeah.
guess we could explain. In the Heights is coming out this month, and that is a movie musical adaptation of a Broadway musical. So we thought with such a large film coming out and on a platform like HBO Max, where literally anyone will be able to watch it if you have that service, regardless of how close or far you are from an actual theater. We thought this is a great movie to build our month around. And so we wanted to talk a bunch of musicals. In particular, we wanted to talk sort of new age musicals. So we're going to start with one in the 70s, but the majority of that will be 1980s onward. We're going to dodge the original era of classic Hollywood musicals and like the ones that won a bunch of Oscars, except the one that we were talking about today did win a bunch of Oscars. But we wanted to focus on some of the more interesting and less direct adaptations. So we wanted to talk more about the ones that made some choices in the way they chose to transfer themselves from the stage to the screen. So with me today is Zach, who loves musicals. It's his favorite genre of all time.
I feel like you're saying that with like sass, but I like musicals. I don't like Broadway, which is this is the issue. But you put Broadway on a big screen, and I'm usually more favorable than like the Broadway nerds that are so rough on anything that gets adapted and is really unfair. And I'm usually into the woods, what it's called. That's what this is. A fun thing because I have
No,
no
it's not.
connection or care to see the other musical because you know what happens on Broadway? It's all fake. There's you can see the props, you can see the stage, you see 5,000 people around you. Um, a movie you can capture and you have a director telling you what to look at. I'm going to look at every fucking thing and I can't focus in a Broadway musical. So I am a musical fan. I just don't like watching stuff on stage because I'm a Philistine.
This is actually a really interesting pairing for this because you are somebody who comes to these movies with very little knowledge of the background musical. I come with knowledge of the background musical, but I don't think I am on the level of some musical theater fans where the movie adaptation can never be better. I think I'm relatively fair in my evaluation of these things. But I also have the context of what they were like originally and the changes they made. And in particular, the one we're talking about today, Cabaret, is a really fascinating example of what happens when you take a Broadway musical, keep the essence of what it is together, but then change some components of it when you transfer it to film and in ways that really work. But before we get stuck into that, let's talk about Last Letterbox Movie with Mr. Zach Ford, who loves this segment. Zach, hit us with your Last Letterbox Movie.
Let me finish getting naked real fast. Okay. Okay.
If you
Okay.
join the Patreon, Zach will take the other shirt off as well.
Well, no, if you're listening to some podcast form, I'm completely nude right now. Um,
Oh, we just
so
got banned from YouTube. All right. All right.
um my last movie I watched on Letterboxd, I is the to date when this episode was actually taped, because everyone knows when the Wisconsin International Film Festival occurs. So like, I knew that was taped in May. I The Wisconsin International Film Festival started today. It's something I've been to for, unfortunately only 4 straight years because last year it was um canceled due to COVID, and this year they're doing an all virtual fest. So I am excited. I still get to go to it, even though I'm not seeing a big screen. But more exciting is that you can get a week pass for a lot cheaper than they ever have been. So I'm doing a week pass and watching shitloads of movies. So I started off today. I'm doing it classic Zack fashion, which is I have like 35 movies I'm interested in watching, and I ran them through a random number generator. And that's the one I started watching. And this is called My Darling Supermarket. This is a documentary, a fairly short, like 70-minute documentary about a grocery store in Brazil. And for the first 20 minutes, it's kind of just watching these grocery store employees do these pretty repetitive, monotonous tasks to where it almost has this like meditative quality to it to watch this like systematic like normacy in a way of people doing this to where it just seems like zen and seems calm, and you see that this is in a way like a connective tissue of society, that these people doing their monotonous task keeps the normacy going in a way that is like a little enlightening. Like it's important to society, and these monotonous things that we do in our life is what part of what makes us exist. So it has these such small scale observations, very specific observations that you can use your own big brain to connect to grander ideas. They don't put anything over. But the other half of the movie, they start letting a lot of the employees speak, and they all just like basically are reading their like deepest, darkest thoughts in their journals, just like their very philosophical and theoretical ideas and like the meaning of life from these grocery store employees. So it's almost like throughout this, that monotonous routine of their job, they have so much time to kind of explore their thoughts in a way, and come off so much more articulate than I ever can, discussing some kind of complex ideas about the point of life. There's also a guy that just talks about how oh my gosh, I'm said my mind is broken. The main character in Dragon Ball Z, about how he should just be like a godlike figure, and they just need to have a religion around Dragon Ball Z because there's a lot to learn from him. And that was a really entertaining 5 minutes. But it's for like a slice of life, not necessarily fly on the wall because they do straight up interviews a little bit. It was an entertaining, interesting way to start. I wonder, like people who've worked at supermarkets, how much they can kind of relate to the experience that they job. But
Goku is the main character of
thank
Dragon Ball
you.
Z.
I was gonna say Grogu, which is Dragon Ball, Baby Yoda.
That's Baby Yoda, which is, let's be real, actually a god, because that's the greatest character of all time. I have 5 different Grogu tattoos on my body. I have a Grogu tramp stamp. It's real important to me. This actually does sound like a really interesting documentary. I do think there are sometimes like real fascinating work that can occur when you just kind of put the camera on people doing really mundane things, like to the outside world, what happens in a supermarket is really kind of boring and mundane. Food ends up on shelves, people buy it, people leave it. But there obviously is a lot more complicated stuff to doing that. You have to figure out, how to stock stuff. What if you get too much? What do you get too little? And I think there's a lot of interesting people who sometimes end up in jobs like that. They have a lot of interesting stories, a lot of, they have a lot of just different paths to any given supermarket. There's the college kids, and there's like somebody in their 50s, and like, why are all these people ended up in the same place? They all have somewhat different but interesting life stories. My last Letterboxd movie is one of the, essentially probably the funniest movie of 2021, and also involves people working mundane and somewhat boring jobs. It is Bad Trip, the Eric Andre and Little Rel Howery road comedy, with also starring Tiffany Haddish. This movie is.
Did I talk about this on the show? I think I talked about this on the show.
Did you? Maybe you did. Okay, maybe you did. Maybe. It's hysterical. They just do everything right. They get a really simple premise. They're on a road trip to find a girl. Good premise. Tiffany Haddish is their sister breaking out of prison. That's always good comedy. And then it's just like they have this really perfect blend of enough interesting stuff and bits to keep you laughing and interested in the story, but also they let you breathe a little bit between each of the funniest bits, so that you actually end up laughing harder each time a new one comes up. There's particularly one with the gorilla that made me like nearly cry laughing. it's just really funny. It's really well put together. They do a lot of really it's kind of like Borat, except Eric Andre just looks like a normal person. So when Eric Andre gets involved in these ridiculous skits with people, you actually are more likely to you see the people believe him more because he's not somebody dressed up with a funny accent and like a costume. He's just like a normal dude. At the beginning of the film, he's detailing somebody's car, and the vacuum cleaner sucks all his clothes off, and he's left naked. And he literally gets this guy to give him his sweatshirt to wrap around his naked junk, and then he hides in a car. There's so many good scenes in it. They trick so many people into getting involved in it. It's just really, really, really funny. And also like on Netflix, 88-minute watch or something. So like I would encourage anyone to just go pop in Bad Trip and laugh their ass off.
I have one issue with your main takeaways from your Letterboxd review. I was immediately like, "This is your takeaway," which I really like the movie. I think I've talked about it. I really like the concept. I think more than actual jokes. I think put a lot of these jokes in a normal comedy, and they're just not my type of humor, and so I go for it. And the fact that the gorilla coming all over people is like where you laugh the most. It makes me like lose all respect for you.
I just
That was like
man.
that was for like grossness over like any kind of like wit to it, and that was the one that was like most like no one can like believe this is actually happening.
They
That
did
this
though.
gorilla is coming up.
But that's what makes it
Think
so
of,
funny is the fact
I
that it's
don't
so
know.
blatantly somebody in a gorilla suit. It doesn't even look remotely like a gorilla, but people are so conditioned to believe that a gorilla is in a gorilla cage. It's just I don't know. That scene killed.
That's
I
the
laughed
one that
so.
I think I thought of most. Like if this was like in an Adam Sandler movie, I was like I would be like a half star. This is the dumbest joke ever put in the
No,
thing. I
here's the thing. It is a terrible joke if you put it in a traditional comedy story structure, but in an actual like prank movie like this, I think it works incredibly well. Mostly because people don't realize what's happening. Like that's the fun. The funny part of that joke is the fact that people aren't able to realize that it's a
yeah.
using a fucking gorilla suit. That's
I'm
the
just
funny
saying, I
part.
think that's when I became most aware that the only reason this works is because of the live audiences rather than the actual jokes themselves. That's when I really started to make that
Oh,
like connection.
I agree. I mean, but the thing is, this movie never tries to be a written studio comedy with dialogue and stuff. It's entirely just the entire film, the entire trip is just a vessel for the jokes. That's why every time they go somewhere, they do something ridiculous. They have the stick his hand in the blender, throwing up because he's drinking. Like all these jokes only work in the context of like the road trip. That was like this really loose framework for all the humor. Um, let's jump ahead. We've got our main film of the evening, which is Cabaret from
It's cabaret.
1970.
Pronounce it correct. Jesus.
That's the American pronunciation. I'm not saying
You don't
Cabaret
say
from
cabinet, you say cabinet.
Cabaret from 1972, which won 8 Oscars. I did not realize this until I was looking at the DVD case. It won 8 Oscars. It's directed by Bob Fosse, starring Liza Minnelli, Michael York, and Joel Grey. And I think we need a Zach Ford plot summary. If I don't know where Zach's gone. Zach's dead.
I'm talking to ghosts on the side. So
Zach Ford plot summary.
cabaret.
Yes.
There's this cabaret
Kit
that
Kat Club.
people dance, KK Club. People dance and sing. It doesn't really play into the plot at all. It's primarily there to kind of provide a song and dance analogy for or like metaphor for what is going on in the country or what is happening in the story so they can act it out through these cabaret performances. But the story itself is about one of the cabaret performers played by Liza Minnelli um, boarding with this British like grad student trying to become a professor who came to teach like English lessons in this dorm, and it's about how they start fucking, and then they both start fucking this British guy, and then there's this other guy learning from him that wants to fuck this Jewish woman primarily for her money, but then they fall in love. It's just about love triangles and things that all kind of have to clash with the Nazi uprising in 1931, causing the conflicts between the relationships. There's also a baby involved, a baby, not baby. there's like a lot. It's hard to really do this because the connective tissue it like makes sense in the movie, but it's hard to describe on paper on how the story like relates to what's happening in Germany and what relates to what's happening on the cabaret stage. But because of the sensory aesthetics of it, I think it makes it make sense in the direction and the editing.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the cabaret performances are designed to comment on the actions going on in the real world, and sort of they are the Greek like they're the Greek chorus of this
Yeah.
film, where they're often commenting on the actions of um, what's his name? Sally Bowles is the Les Milling character, and Brian Roberts is the Michael York character. Um, I will tell you, in the original play, um, almost all of the love stuff is not existing. The Baron guy does not exist in the original, and neither do the Jewish couple that the Jewish couple that like the that famously are.
Keep going. I just have to move room. Sorry for the interruption.
No, it's okay. I'll continue. The Jewish couple that exists is like the sort of secondary romance where the guy wants to be with this girl who's very rich, and initially we think they can't be together because he's Christian and she's Jewish, and then eventually realize that he is actually Jewish and lied about it because he realized that the uprising and like the upcoming rise of the Nazi Party is potentially dangerous for him. There's also a lot of commentary in the film from the upper class of British society of German society about how the Nazis are just a bunch of thugs and they'll take care of the communists, and then we will eventually, be able to control them, which is actually quite prescient and very telling about all terms of long-term. Back to the 1930s, basically, if you look at these dangerous groups of radicals, of these extremists, as just kind of goofy or not that dangerous, they may not be in one moment, but they inevitably will gain power, and it's clear that over time there is clearly an appeal to these type of groups that causes them to go from a bunch of people walking around in brown shirts handing out pamphlets to the ruling class of the European continent.
Yeah, because it also, I think Fosse kind of does this. He has this really love-hate relationship with his craft. I think that's evident through all his movies, and I think this movie especially, it has kind of a sinister look at the cabaret itself, to where it's almost as it gets darker as Nazis continue to invade, it really becomes a like commentary on how entertainment suits as a distraction, but sometimes that is a unhealthy distraction to hide away from the horrors that is happening around us. And I think it's really amazing how the tone changes within the cabaret scenes that mirror the heightening of the suspense. Otherwise, almost saying like you can't use this cabaret as distraction anymore. And it's in the song that like this is the place to have fun or be safe or whatever they say about the cabaret. But that is by the time they sing it in the reprise at the end, it's like ironic. It is not to be taken seriously. It's not this place to hide away from what is happening in Nazi Germany.
Well, the cabaret is also a representation of the decline that Germany undergoes throughout the film. In the beginning of it, there is you at least understand the appeal in the early on scenes, why people would go there, why they would drink, why they would hang out with these girls. And by the end, they are grotesque caricatures. You get down to the end of the film, and a guy's dancing with a gorilla. Like the decline from like the intended sexiness and like trashy but kind of appealing aesthetic of the original of the beginning of the film down to the end is just a dramatic fall off the cliff, which is also mirrored by the fact at the beginning of the film the Nazis are just handing out pamphlets, and by the end of the film they're the entire group of people at a picnic singing a song, or they're killing animals and writing Juden on people's front doors. Like their rise in power is mirrored by the decline in the attractiveness of the interior of the Kit Kat Club.
Yeah, it's a rising threat in a way. Yeah, the Kit Kat Club becomes a threat in its own druggy, surreal fashion.
Yeah, let's talk about the best performance in this film, which is Joel Grey as the MC.
Yeah.
I think I think that Liza Minnelli's the flashy performance. Michael York is kind of the character we're following story. But I think Joel Grey is the character that steals literally every scene he's on screen. Even just his face popping up in the background to like wink at people or to like stick his tongue out is such an appealing presence. He is as far as I know, the only member of the original Broadway cast that also transferred over to the film. And you can just see he has an extra level of understanding of that character to the point where he just always seems like he is 100% the MC.
Yeah.
And he's just wonderful. His dance numbers, his singing is great. He's also just he's a weird looking person, especially when they apply the white makeup to him. He's got a kind of almost it's a smile, but it's a very sinister smile throughout the film, and he's just absolutely kills it in every one of the dance and song numbers he has.
I think he's also key to connect to the point we were just saying. I think for the cabaret to devolve into this sinister atmosphere, he kind of leads the way. He has all the tonal control and what's happening in those scenes. Because the beginning and the way he's interacting with the women on stage and the way he's interacting with the audience, it is just like this playful master of ceremonies to where by the end he seems more predatory against these women and more not like someone having fun, but someone with other motives to where even like they have one shot of him like actually being predatory to Liza Minnelli's character, just like a shot of him like grabbing her from behind. That's like a whole different, more malevolous spirit to what we kind of were brought to this character because we're like, oh, this guy's funny, he's welcome us. It's like I can't be with this guy anymore. I don't know what he's going to do. He might be the devil incarnate by the end of this movie.
And kind of that fall from your audience perspective is mirrored by the kind of the falling out of love that the Michael York character has with Berlin. Like he comes there as this kind of optimist. He's like, I'm going to teach kids English, and he kind of falls for Bowles. And then over time, you really realizes that like all these people are really shitty, and they're all just trying to do. They're only out for themselves, and he's the one who wants to be like. And then he realizes like Sally can say all this stuff about loving him and wanting to be with him, but then at the same time, she's totally willing to play. She's willing to go basically fuck anyone who she thinks can help her career at any moment at any time. And you see by the end of the film that he has really fallen out of love with the entire city to the point where he just can't be there anymore.
Yeah, but there is I feel like you just gave Liza Minnelli's character a hard time because I think like it was kind of an agreed upon thing in the relationship. Because I it was almost like she was part of the seductiveness of the city to where a point like he is still very amiable to her, on their leave, and you can kind of still sense that there's some kind of friendship there as he's out. It's just his like lust for her is gone, not this like hate, but it just lost that magic touch that was there. But I think maybe I don't even think it's by her cheating around, but just by the awkward interactions of everything they got brought into. Because he got brought into that kind of sexual lifestyle of hers that was kind of the antithesis of he's almost a non-sexual being in a way. So it's just that whole fall into the sexual world of it. Because it's not just her, but he was also having an affair with the Baron. The same person. So it's almost like he was losing his morals as the country was losing his morals. Not necessarily with her to blame. It was just part of that, a representative of part of that world.
I don't know if it's her to blame, but I think it's her direct actions that causes the veil to be lifted. I do think he comes into this as an idealist, and he does truly think he is in a relationship with just her, and that it is a truly monogamous one, built on something more than just a simple attraction or a lust. And I think over time, what gets really stripped from him is this idealistic view of her as some kind of pure being. And to be clear, I'm not saying he should have had this in the first place, because I think it's stupid to look at her and go, this person is somehow pure or somehow monogamous in any way. I think what does happen over as the film goes on, I think he tricks himself into believing that's the reality, and then is over time forced to kind of be confronted by the fact, oh, there's the Baron, and then there's other people, and like he starts, I think it becomes unwind to the point where he realizes that he got seduced into the idea of the cabaret and this idea of like what it was, and the fall of the cabaret coincides with the fall of his idealism and his belief in like the best nature of people, to the point where at the end he leaves somewhat of a broken person, not necessarily hating Sally, but just kind of done with the ordeal. Like he just doesn't want to be there anymore.
But even that veil you mentioned was pulled off halfway through the movie, and instead of him like denouncing her then or realizing, his naivete in a way, he continues to go down the rabbit hole with her. he like is mad for a second. And he's like, I'm also going to participate, within this threesome, within this, more sinful, in quotations, world that's happening in Berlin. It's more like the drug that brings him further down rather than making him ashamed right away. I think it has its effects hours later, just not like an immediate.
Oh no, I agree. I agree with what you're saying. I think it does draw him in, but I think he also tries to. I think he gets the idealism ripped away, and then he tries to play the game that everybody else is playing.
Yeah,
and it takes him a while to realize that not only does he can't get the idealism back, but he also can't play that game. That's just not him as a person. And so that's why, that character just ends up being the one who has to exit the world of the Kit Kat Club.
Yeah, because it's almost like when she becomes pregnant, even if it's not his kid, that's almost like he sees as his like string back to his reality and back to normalcy and what he thinks is a gentlemanly like existence
Right.
to have as a father. And so then once that's taken away from him when she has an abortion, then it's kind of once again he's about to get tricked again. He won't let that happen to where he just leaves. He's like, I'm not going to go through this, the second time.
I do think, to be honest, the sort of random sudden abortion she gets is a pretty large betrayal for his character. Like, I think he believes that they're working towards some kind of relationship. They're going to have a kid. It's not the perfect scenario. It's not the idealistic scenario he imagined, where they fall in love and they just kind of have a great life. But I think it brought him like foundation. It centered him back in what he wanted to be focused. So when she just randomly walks in one day and says, "Oh, I just had an abortion and it was one of my whims," I think that's the moment where he goes, "I can't be with this person. This is just a foreign concept to me to, like, on a whim, go from being I'm going to have a baby with you to being I got an abortion." Like, the sudden switch in that is something that totally works for her character. That's very much in her nature, and the world that she runs in totally understands the idea. The world of the Kit Kat Club totally understands why the main star of the club would suddenly go from being I'm going to have a kid to I'm not going to have a kid overnight, because of what she's trying to do in show business. She just probably doesn't want a kid. But for him, it is really kind of the rug being pulled out from under him, and it is kind of the final straw that really just breaks the camel's back. If he's just like, I'm out, I can't do this anymore. I think he really does love her, but I think he also realizes that he might love a version of Sally that is not the version of Sally that he always gets. Like, he loves the best version of Sally, and the best version of Sally might not be the version of Sally that is always appearing before everyone and making all the decisions in her own life.
I think it's more he loves her for who she is, but it's not healthy for him, and he realizes it's not the best life that he maybe wants to live. But I think he accepts her for who she is. I think because you were hating on this a little bit, but I think a big part of what makes this movie work is they don't villainize her. They have some level of like sympathy or understanding of who her character is, because neither Michael York's character nor the movie, I think, treats her as a villain. Even when she has the abortion, once again, he always has this like 30 seconds of like deep breath, kind of being upset about it, like being caught by surprise, but then he can turn much more understanding and caring, and therefore, like right after, at the end, a little bit of a different way, less in a romantic way, but back to that kind of friend lifestyle because he still has the feelings for her, and he also understands that this is who she is. She's not a bad person because she's acting out like her truth. And that's important for this movie's understanding of personal identity, because it's easy to be moralistic and say this is a shameful, horrible life for people who live in cabarets. And I think it avoids any of those, moralistic finger pointing, finger waving things. But more just saying people can, be from different worlds, and it's hard for those worlds to mix.
Well, I think he is angry. I think the thing that makes it work is that the film always frames it as, well, you should have known this was coming. This is always who Sally is. Sally doesn't hide who she is. So the fact that you're frustrated about these moments of Sally's choices when they're totally in line with her as a character, like being angry at her for sleeping with the other person when that's totally in line with what she does as a character and what she's been through throughout the entire film, is just somebody who has totally admitted that that is part of them as a person. So that when these events happen, you can understand why characters feel betrayed or characters feel hurt, but the movie can never play her as a villain because the character is just genuinely herself at all time. And like many characters out the film, genuinely themselves, for better or for worse. So the film in some facts doesn't make any judgments either way because it just lets the characters be the most genuine version of themselves.
Since we kind of are talking about Liza Minnelli, That
So
connects us to my thing. Yeah, I want to talk about her because I think her performance is broad in a specific way to me that I think is how the movie functions well. Where I think her performance, especially, but the movie as a whole, is still very steeped in this very classical musical style, as far as and her kind of big, exaggerated reveal the dialogue. It's all very earnest and very like um, drama kitty and everything's like this. It's really reminiscent of her mom, Judy Garland's performances away and how she delivers dialogue. There's nothing subtle or nuanced about the performance. And I think even some of the dialogue can come off, a little cheesy, and a little stiff in a way that classic musicals, especially in the 50s, kind of had those lines too. Like some of the jokes seemed like they could have been in the 50s line or 50s movies. But they're taking that and like putting it into a blender with like new Hollywood and with drugs and making the most like acid form version of that kind of classic Hollywood would feel possible. And I think yes, because her performance, I think, is very similar to Judy Garland's performance. If Judy Garland like was fucking, was just like having sex all around, and was like open with herself, and in a way, that's how cabarets function. Cabarets are, centered on a kind of musical style that was very mainstream in the 30s and 40s. That kind of like jazz, big bandy style, but then they make it more sinister, more sexual. Um, and I think that it's kind of that's what like is my primary interest in this movie. I find that such a unique total challenge because I think you take out all the fucking and this movie could be made in the 1950s,
mhm.
1940s. Um, but they add a lot of sexual tension. They make everyone in the cabaret, looks a little more counterculture, a little more devilish than an average musical actress would look in a way that just subverts your expectations of what a musical could be, especially in the 70s. And I think that's definitely a transition into New Hollywood and like what can musicals be moving to New Hollywood, especially after they were like dead in the late 60s. It was like almost a representation of the end of classic Hollywood is how musicals were failing, and this showed how it could take a step forward.
Yeah, it's in some ways the reason why it makes the great first film in our month about musical adaptations. This does have kind of some of the echoes of the classic Hollywoods, but also like it's dirty, it's grimy, it's nasty, it's it's a little messed up at times. There's a lot more violence, there's a lot more sex, there's a lot more debauchery. It's also not even like there are sexy moments in classic movies, but it's always in the context of passion and romance and a couple. In this film, it's like they throw everything at you. They throw sexually transmitted infections, and they throw prostitution, and they throw like transvestites, and like they throw every spectrum that you could
Yeah.
possibly think could come out of a club that people would pay for. There's like a BDSM scene in this film. Like there's multiple they touch on so many different things throughout this film that like it
It,
really is it's just like they're to throw it all at you. They're like, club, we offer everything. You'll love it or you'll hate it, but we're gonna offer everything. They're just open and out there with like what the club is offering to their patrons.
and they traded the like classic Hollywood romance for lust. So it still deals with this relationship between the two leads like they would in a classic movie, but you never believe there's this whimsical romance that
No.
the movies will force upon it. It's all lust.
Yeah, I mean, even like there's moments in the film where you think Michael York has like a he has a real he thinks he's in love with her, but like
Yeah.
that is the idea of romance, the idea of like finding your one person is like kind of constantly dashed throughout the film. In fact, a failure in romance, like a failure in actual like committed relationships is a kind of consistent through line. Like there's a lot of people trying to be with somebody or trying to be with somebody else, and oftentimes throughout the film, those just fail, and you kind of realize that the film shows you that the only things that works is kind of this lifestyle where you kind of jump from one bed to another night to night. Like the idea of the classical musical and its one true central romance is just thrown out the window completely in a way that is like kind of one of the biggest indications that this is a different era of musicals. We're not doing Oklahoma or something where the entire film is based around two people ending up together. That's not happening. This is about, the club, this atmosphere, and also really and more importantly, the rise of fascism throughout Germany.
Yeah. So I know I just like briefly touched on Liza Minnelli when I said I wanted to be here, but I just found it. I just found it that energy was so specific because she is this like messed up. I don't messed up's the wrong term, but a little twisted version of her mom, of Judy Garland. She still has
Really
those
is.
big eyes and that earnestness, but you place her in the 70s and place her in that more scandalous environment, and Liza Minnelli's like really embraced that kind of persona in a way that helped her, I think, succeed past her mom's shadow to where people forget. It helped her be her own identity, even though there's so much that she has in common. So it'd be hard to pass that shadow.
It's almost like Cabaret is the film that lets Liza Minnelli play Judy Garland if Judy Garland could have been honest as a star in the 40s and 50s. Like, if you go back and look at Judy Garland's life, there's a lot of like craziness and unhealthiness and just like bad stuff going on. But to the audience and to like the studios, the only thing that mattered was that Judy Garland was this pure little girl who was on Wizard of Oz and then just went on, did these cute little musicals, and she was supposed to be like the perfect girl next door. And in some respects, by Cabaret is a film that allows its star to be just open about all this stuff that would typically that would be traditionally be somewhat taboo. In fact, I was reading about like the original musical, like Julie Andrews turned down the original musical on Broadway because like her agent was like, no, we're not putting her in something like that because it was looked at as like actively bad for your career. And obviously they didn't really know that the 70s was going to come around and change like the way that film was looked at completely. But like, this is a film that like 5 or 6 years earlier you probably don't make, at least not in this way, because it just this movie only exists in a post Midnight Cowboy, post I'm trying to think other
Butch
like Hallmark.
Cassidy.
Yeah, you need films like that to come out and show you like a rougher, darker side of the world for something like Cabaret to like fit in and be a major Oscar player in a season that is also filled with like other all-time great films.
Yeah. So let's keep moving through performances because then we can talk about Michael York. Michael York is such an odd looking fucking guy.
He really is.
And once again, I think his performance is pretty solid because I think he, between the way he carries himself and the way his face looks, without kind of big judgments, is like if you just look at him for a half a second, like you just like have a blinky look at him, he seems like this perfect, upstanding, classical actor. Someone that could have existed in the 40s and 50s in the golden age of Hollywood. But there's just like I said with Liza Minnelli, there's something just a little bit off. His face is just a little bit distorted. His, persona is a little more, I think, insecure in a way to make that kind of nobleness really, thrive. I think there's something just a little more flamboyant and to the left of what a classic actor would be, even though just a little bit twitches, he would be a Gregory Peck, he would be a Gary Cooper. To where, once again, I think that it represents the whole tone of this movie. A little twitches. This is a classic musical, but him in this movie is edgy a little bit more, a little more wide, a little edgier.
He's interesting in that he has. You're right. He has the traditional look. His voice is a little soft. It's a little bit effeminate in a way that a lot of the stars of that era don't have. You kind of understand why he ends up playing. I mean, it's stereotypical, but he ends up playing the bisexual character, and you can see that he's not as much of a man's man, using quotation marks here, as like the traditional Hollywood stars would have been. Like you're right, he is a little bit left of center. You can see that he would be, he's a little different than, the sort of raging heterosexuality of a lot of the 1950s and 1960s stars, where like the idea that they would ever play somebody that could potentially be with a man is just completely outside the idea of what anyone either in the public or in the studio system would have thought. Like you never would have cast those people in those type of roles. But he just has a difference to him that allows him to be something like that. He's just interesting. You sort of understand why he never got as much of a career as some of those other people you mentioned, because he's somebody that I don't necessarily think would fit in like the traditional like male lead roles. Like he has the look for them, but I think there's his acting style. You'd almost be turned off by that in like a really traditional um, role you would see from Gary Cooper. You'd be like, why is this dude acting kind of weird? Like, why is he
Yeah.
like, dude, you're supposed to be the sheriff. We just want you to be like the tough guy. Why are you like, there's something to him that's just different than like the traditional male stars of that time.
I mean, he has a real like villainous look to him. He is an Austin Powers, kind of playing off that little villainous turn that he has, but I don't think he's a villain. I'm trying to forget who his role. No, he's like the M in Austin Powers. So once again, even with Austin Powers taking that him like he could be this like spy, but there's just something off, so you throw him into the parody version of a spy movie. But like has he played like a villain? He seems like a perfect Bond villain or like a perfect Die Hard villain. He easily could have like fit into those type of roles. There's something, yeah,
Honest,
real
I'm
malevolent about him.
not very familiar with his career.
Well, we're doing Michael York month in October, so be ready for this.
I don't think we even have enough movies we want to cover to do Michael York month.
But I do think he kind of functions almost as like stand-in for these Cary Grants and these James Stewarts. So it's like taking the idea of what happens. So like this could have been proposed. Like what happens if you take the perfect American 1930s man, you take Jimmy Stewart, and you throw him into Berlin, and what is his downfall and all his sins and all his ego and his id gets to fully come out and in a way, I think that's why he still has that connection to those Hollywood guys that always had to, put on the facade a little bit and hide their flamboyant nature or hide those sinful natures.
Well, I mean, also like this movie doesn't work with the traditional male star in it. Like if Cary Grant walks into that club, you would be like, why the hell is Cary Grant in this club? Why isn't he somewhere better?
Because
or like with Gary Cooper, it'd be like, you seem like way too upstanding of a citizen to be in a place like this. This is weird. There is
that's
something
what I'm saying.
about.
But I think you think that about him right away. But once you get to know him a little more, because he's not putting on that facade, because he is unveiling, his skin and falling to the world, that you see him as someone that belongs there. But I think when you just see him watching, you're like, this seems like he is real out of place, and he is a fish out of water in a way.
Yeah, I think that's what works for the film is because he is the audience surrogate in some respects, that he does come off really out of water and unclear about this world. Like Sally is totally comfortable and he is just not in the beginning, but then you do kind of get the movie works because you kind of follow him as he gets seduced into the world, and then also kind of when he feels rejected by it and has to pull out and like walk away. Like that's kind of the arc of the film that you as a viewer also experience.
Yeah.
So
how's your Michael York research coming?
He's in
You look like you're doing something.
I did look it up a little bit. He's in Taming of the Shrew with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. He was in Space. He was in Spaceballs. And then like he has a very weird career, and then his big projects come years apart at times, like sometimes 5 to 10 to 15 years difference, which is interesting. Let's talk about the relationship that kind of brings him in and then also rejects him is the relationship with Baron Maximilian Hune, who is revealed to be bisexual and sleeping with both of them, which is an interesting moment because it's a moment where she's like tries to throw it at him that she's sleeping with him, and he's like, well, I am too. And this is sort of like revealing to the audience because you really don't expect Brian to have gone down that road. There is at least hints from the beginning that his his sexuality may not be as simple as
I think
purely
it's pretty
heterosexual.
explicit right away.
Well, I think in the
It's
beginning,
almost more surprising that he fell
it's
for
not.
her eventually than he fell for him because she was so open. Like I have had sex for women and it did not go well. Like it was just not a experience. And he almost decided to be celibate because any experimental side of his sexuality was being more repressed by the society he was growing up in.
Yeah.
So it was almost like she was the odd one, but he was maybe more his affair with him was more that his true sexuality coming out.
Yeah, it is interesting to see what is the actual, is one of those relationships just seduction into a world that is unfamiliar and new to you, or is that actually something you fell for? Is that actually the truer version of yourself?
Because I think even his resistance to the Baron being part of their friendship and his resistance to her having a relationship with him is more him once again trying to distance himself from that side of him. It's still his habit of repressing himself and sexuality coming out through him being upset about her relationship with him, even though that may not be the point of it all.
Yeah, I think that his rejection, his anger about the guy is, I think in some ways very much a confirmation of his traditional upbringing in a British society where the territorial nature of your relationships is important to maintain. So I think in fact he views the Baron as somebody who's infringing on his turf. And that's why I think he rejects him at the beginning. I do think as the relationship goes on, the relationship gets more complicated, and you do start to see that the Baron is playing both sides and flirting more with Brian than you would thought initially. And that's, I think, when the relationship becomes increasingly complicated for him, because he doesn't know how to deal with not just what he perceives as a threat to his woman, but also then somebody who's also seems to be into him. And I think that's when it becomes a real counterbalance between trying to protect what he considers to be this monogamous relationship versus also potentially exploring something that he may not have been able to explore in other circumstances.
Yeah. So I think one of the major themes of why they use the Nazi background is the repression that fascist regimes, let alone any kind of normal society, puts upon people, and how they have a control over our ideas and our prejudices, and so that his almost homophobic prejudice beginning, that he's rejected his homosexuality because he was taught to be fear of it, is mirroring how the Nazis are taking over and creating this universal idea throughout Germany of that Jewish people are evil and we need to get rid of them. Yeah, it's almost saying Nazism has some of the horrors of it. You can be found in other societies, and we tend to want to distance ourselves from that idea.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it's the Nazis' ideology was just a combination of all these different hatreds and bigotries all put together. If you really look at them over time, the one that we commonly think of is the hatred of Jewish people, but also they did not gypsies and homosexuals and intellectuals and religious people and this and that and all these other things.
Yeah.
There's so many different things that got sucked into that hatred. They were just a group that was built on hate, like all extremists, all fascists are. And I think what the biggest message of the film comes down to is that you can't ignore the growing of this fascist threat, because it's easy to ignore when it's just a couple people in your audience at the cabaret. Yeah. But then you cut to the end of the film. The final punch of the film is a pan shot of the audience where 25%, 30% of the people are wearing swastikas. It's gone from being a couple people and a couple people begging for money and handing out pamphlets to it's the dominant thing in a society. And you even see
it was almost like the seductiveness, almost like an STD, as they keep referencing STDs and how it can, spread through people. His, fall into the sexual underworld was, in a way, the innocent comparison to the Germany falling to the Nazi underworld.
Yeah.
Falling for their seduction.
You really get to see throughout the film how like you almost get to see the rise of the Nazi Party. They go from being people handing out pamphlets, and then suddenly there are kids who are standing up and supporting this ideology, and you're like, well, if the kids are supporting it, their parents must be as well. So it really starts to show the spread, and then you see the older people are initially hesitant, but then the final scene, some of the individuals in the audience wearing swastikas are people who are older, and you kind of just see that this rises from this like really small spark in the society to like something that just is spread and is really pervasive throughout the entire population. There's also another subplot with Fritz Wendell, who is a German Jew passing as Protestant, who falls in love with Natalia Landauer, who's a German heiress who is Jewish. This is a subplot that is not in the original musical, and it's not in the original musical, but it is sort of replacing a relationship that is in the original musical. I think this is we need to have one relationship where the prospect of being Jewish is complicating the relationship as the Nazi Party begins to rise. Initially, the concern in the relationship is, oh, is he just money grubbing? She's the rich one, he's the poor one. And by the end of the film, it's Germany is not a good place to be if you're Jewish.
Yeah. In a way, he is the opposite of Michael York's character. He is the person who is kind of part of this underworld. He is a con artist in a way. He is kind of scum and a partier, to where he's finding his way out and finding his way more into a graceful society, and being more open, with himself in an honest way, embracing his Jewishness and not wanting to hide that. So almost coming out of that underworld I got trapped in, and he was putting it on a facade to look worse than he is in a way.
Yeah, he is the opposite. He's somebody who's already invested in it and kind of down with the playboy lifestyle, and then suddenly starts off very clearly trying to get this girl just because of her money, and then actually does fall for her to the point where he's willing to admit that he's been lying about his religion this entire time, lying about his ethnicity, and admitting that he's Jewish so that they can be together. Even though at the time period where he chooses to do this, that's really not a good choice, based on the places that the German society is heading.
Yeah, imagine what happens to those characters, 5 years after this movie. It's a dark world event.
Right, and that's in some ways what makes the film so impressive, and like what is a good framing device is the fact that this starts in 1931. I don't know how long it continues, but it continues probably not too long in the future. But the idea that like the Nazism is this spread in 1931, years before the beginning of the World War, years before the Nazis would begin to round up Jews and put them in concentration camps. Watching how dangerous and how scary they are as a figure and how they rise throughout the film, even when years before like the events that we typically know them for, is I think a really impactful framing device, in some ways more impactful than if they'd set this in 1937 when we already kind of expect the Nazi Party to be this power. I want to talk for a second about the changes they made when adapting this from the Broadway musical. So there's some. No, this is actually an interesting discussion. You can participate. I think this is interesting because I'm not going to talk about this in terms of like the theater nerd. I think I'm just the technical differences they changed. So they made Sally Bowles is English in the stage version. She's American in this one. Brian Roberts is named Clish Bradshaw and is American in the stage version, but Brian Roberts is British in the music version. So there's a couple like small stuff.
That could also just be for castings like this. Like found a person that like fits the role, I think, better, and just decide to play it to their ethnicity.
That's a very realistic moment. One of the larger ones is the original, the Cabaret stage version has a romance between Fräulein Schnauder, who owns the boarding house, and a Jewish grocer named Herr Schultz. And they have like a doomed romance throughout it. And in some ways, they are replaced in the movie by, she literally just said his name, and I'm going to forget this, Fritz Wendell and Natalia Landauer. Like that's sort of the relationship that gets switched. in some ways it's just like I think they made a choice to have a younger relationship rather than an older relationship, but they serve the same purpose throughout the story. There's also like a lot of different song choices. Um, in the movie, she sings "Mein Hair." In the original, it's a song called "Don't Tell Mama." Um, they replace several other songs. They take some songs that got pulled from the stage version and put them back into the main version. They actually play they pull several songs from the movie version, but then play them as instrumentals and transition sequences. It's actually quite a different musical than it is movie, but I actually think they do a really good job keeping what's important about the musical when they adapt it to the actual movie. I think they keep the essence, they keep the general themes, and I think it's actually a really cool example of the way that you can adapt a Broadway musical in an intelligent, thoughtful way and make a movie that is also equally valuable. Often we see either the straight adaptation where they literally take the entire musical and they film it, and sometimes that works and sometimes it's very boring, or you see what we've seen in sort of the modern era, which is sort of like the lazier adaptations, like something like the film movie version of Rent, where they basically just took the musical and I think added one song, which is what I commonly refer to as the try to win an Oscar song.
Yeah.
They add one new song to it and then just kind of throw it together, but it also feels kind of slapdash and not particularly well done. This one, you can really see Bob Fosse really was interested in adapting it as a movie. Like, I think he understands the value of what a musical is and what a movie is and how those things are different and how you need to think about them differently in creation when building them. So I think that's in some ways why this is so effective, is that there really is a lot of thought going into how they would take the original source material and turn it into a movie without just shot for shot transferring it.
Yeah, you need a real stylist, a real auteur's mind to do something unique and something make, even with plays to make something that was made for stage cinematic takes a real eye. Not someone who just likes the source material, but someone who likes it and has an actual idea, and someone who likes the source material and also likes the magic of cinema. You have to be able to meld the both. And I think Bob Fosse was the perfect person for this. And he was the perfect person to revitalize the musical in the early 70s and do something crazy with it, because that's like the epitome of his career, is how he sexualized musicals in a way.
Yeah, let's talk about the Oscars, because this is actually one of the last musicals of an era where this is one of the few musicals of the 70s that gets big Oscar play like musicals the 60s does. So this is the 1945 Oscars. Cabaret is nominated for Best Picture and loses to The Godfather. Ever heard of it?
I legit always think Cabaret wins. This makes me look like a dumbass.
Cabaret wins Best Director for Bob Fosse over Francis Ford Coppola. Liza Minnelli wins Best Actress for Sally Bowles. Joel Grey wins for Best Supporting Actor as the MC over three different performances in The Godfather and Eddie Albrecht in The Heartbreak Kid. Let's see, what else? It loses Best Screenplay based on material from another author, from another medium, to The Godfather.
Imagine Cabaret's reputation if it won Best Picture.
I know, right? It wins Best Scoring Adaptation and an Original Song Score. It doesn't have any Best Original Song because it doesn't do that.
Yeah.
It wins
the best thing that could have happened to its legacy is losing Best Picture. Even if they got Best Picture.
It wins Best Sound, Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, and Best Film Editing. It's funny to look back in time and realize that The Godfather wins Best Picture
and actor,
and wins Best Picture, Actor, and Screenplay, and nothing else. Cabaret is the one that wins like 8 Oscars and really cleans up that year. It doesn't win picture, but it's the one that it gets as many nominations. They both get 10 nominations. It wins 8 awards, and The Godfather wins 3. So, the winner of the 1940s.
I think it's almost amazing that Godfather won Best Picture, because I think Cabaret is still so steeped in what classic Hollywood a lot of the voters might have still been going for, and that's why it won 8 awards. But Godfather is just undeniable.
Well, it's also interesting that the movie that would lose the majority of the awards would then pull out Best Picture. That's just, an interesting thing.
But I said the best possible thing that could happen for Cabaret, because its legacy would have been tarnished by like one of the worst Oscar decisions ever. How could that be The Godfather? Like, How Green Was My Valley. These other movies are really good. How Green Was My Valley, I love. I like it more than Citizen Kane. Um, they get such a bad rap, and people don't even watch it just because like Citizen Kane supposed to be the best movie ever. So how could it? It's a really unfair tarnishing of quality movies. Like Cabaret, avoided by that they were able to have their cake and eat it too. They won a lot of big awards, but they can also thrive without getting this rep for destroying one of the best movies of all time.
Yeah, it is interesting how oftentimes when that happens, not only do you get the blowback against the movie that wins, but oftentimes people will literally not watch the movie that wins out of anger against that film, which is stupid. And also, like, I don't know, watch it so you can form an opinion and you can actually say if that was the right choice or not. Like, it's like all the people who say Saving Private Ryan should have beaten Shakespeare in Love. I actually agree that Shakespeare in Love should have lost, but like, I actually watched both movies, and I feel like most of the people making that statement have never watched Shakespeare in Love.
Yeah, but I mean, if you don't actually watch the movie, you're just forming your movie opinions on the general consensus, which is there should be no objective consensus within films. Everyone has their own experiences you brought to it. So give every movie a chance and make your own ideas of what you think is great, and it doesn't need to be compared directly to other movies based on awards. Like a movie for its own, but its bringing is great.
Zach, why don't you give us your final thoughts on Cabaret?
I really love it. I said I really appreciate it for tonally what it's doing. Really how it's moving the genre forward. I think that's why I really find fascinating about Bob Fosse, because he is someone so well versed in classic Hollywood that is the only person that knew how to advance it into a changing world, a changing society, and someone like brave is a silly word to use, but like brave enough to be ambitious with the form. And he's a troubled man, but also just a really interesting, um, take on movies I love, and just a real stylist. There should have been a 40-minute dream sequence, like there was and all that jazz. They're missing that, but
the entire film is a dream sequence, Zach.
Yeah, that's true.
I will say, the first time I watched Cabaret, it was when I was in Cabaret, and I think at the time I was annoyed by all the differences they make. On rewatch, those differences really stand out as like the brilliance of Bob Fosse and like the brilliance of the adaptation. This movie rules. It's so cool. It's so interesting. Joel Grey, Liza Minnelli are just fantastic. There's so many good songs, so many good numbers. It's such an interesting commentary. I think the biggest difference between the movie and one of the biggest advantages of the movie over the musical is how effectively it makes the case about the rise of fascism throughout the film. I think it just does it much more effectively. Like, you constantly feel the rising of what is initially just a couple guys beating people up to like an entire group of people standing united. And I think it's a really powerful message, a really powerful film, and weirdly prescient to the times, because that idea of that we can't ignore the rising of extremism, regardless of how large the extremism starts at, is just something that will be evergreen. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We will be back next week when we cover Little Shop of Horrors, as we continue our discussion of Broadway musicals, movie adaptations. Yeah, this has been fun. I guess it's song time, Zach. Should we do songs?
Go for it. I don't know the words. I'm just gonna go pippity boppity poopity boo.
All right. I know what you're thinking. You wonder why I chose her out of all the ladies in the world. That's just a first impression. What's good's a first impression if you knew her like I do? The Lucas and Zack podcast would change your point of view.